For Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour to rise to speak at report stage of Bill C-14. As I stated earlier in this House, it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court of Canada has taken it upon themselves to force legislation to be written which overturns thousands of years of our understanding of the intrinsic value and dignity of every human life. The Supreme Court has done this, completely rejecting the fact that elected members of this House have rejected initiatives to legalize physician-assisted suicide on at least 15 occasions since 1991. Most recently, a bill to allow physician-assisted suicide was rejected in 2010 by a vote of 59 to 226. Not only have 9 unelected judges inserted themselves into a national conversation that should be initiated in this House of Commons, they have also even lamented the fact that an extension was sought to give parliamentarians more time to properly study, discuss, and debate this issue of exceptional importance. In their judgment of January 15, 2016, in granting an extension, the Supreme Court states, quote, that the legislative process needs more time is regrettable, but it does not undermine the point that it is the best way to address this issue, end quote. Mr. Speaker, really? Regrettable? It's regrettable to take more time to think soberly through this complex issue, to implement such momentous change, to destroy the very foundations of medicine, to turn upside down the time-honored belief that it's fundamentally wrong to kill another human being, and all in the name of compassion. In regard to the impatience on the part of the Supreme Court, Warren Perley writes in Best Story, quote, common sense dictates that such momentous changes to the law governing assisted suicide should be based on the compass rather than the clock. Until this point, Canadians have never had access to legally assisted suicide. Instead, they have relied on doctors and nurses to administer palliative care, which must include adequate pain management and, in rare cases, palliative sedation. Pro-euthanasia advocates argue this is euthanasia, but they are in error, end of quote. Changing laws in matters of such substantive and exceptional significance as assisted suicide should be made by the compass. I could not agree more, Mr. Speaker. But unfortunately, we have thrown away our compass. We no longer need a compass. We now just pool our collective ignorance and decide on the basis of popular opinion to sail off in any direction that suits the winds of the day, rudderless. Mr. Speaker, one of Canada's Indigenous leaders, Mr. Francois Paulette, a Dene leader and chair of the Yellowknife-Stanton Territorial Health Authority, states that Indigenous people are bound by spiritual law, not man-made law. He goes on to state, quote, we don't play God. God is responsible for bringing us into this world and taking our life. It's pretty straightforward, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, whether as a member of the Indigenous community or not, for all Canadians, the crux of the issue before us today and the source of the conflict and confusion is the fact that the preamble of our Charter and Rights and Freedoms on one hand and Bill C-14 on the other are built on two opposite pillars, one made of gold, the other of styrofoam. The preamble of the Charter states, recognizing the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Yes, there is a compass. Yes, there is a North Star. And even our Canadian Charter states that in Canada, we do recognize the North Star, the supremacy of God. Yet, if we look at the first paragraph of C-14, we see a totally opposite starting point. Rather than supremacy of God, we see autonomy of persons. My contention is that these two opposite philosophies cannot coexist at the same time if we are to continue to have true freedom and trust in our society. We may deny God and man as his image bearer. We can try to kill both God and man as man. We may press forward in a suicidal course, but it always ends in pure vanity. For we are surrounded inside and out by the reality of God and his order in every sphere of life. We all know that there are necessary limits placed on the autonomy of humans, yet on an issue as monumental as the issue of life and death, we're considering extending autonomy without stopping to think what such autonomy might do to our understanding of the value of human life. Does this autonomy serve well those among us who, for dozens of reasons, find themselves vulnerable, voiceless, and open to abuse in the most extreme and final way possible, an unwanted, hastened death? The very fact that I can drive from my riding of Kitchener-Conestoga to Ottawa each Sunday evening is because autonomy of all drivers is limited. Drivers heading to Kitchener occupy the north side of the 401 highway as they travel west. So I am free to travel unimpeded on my easterly journey in the southern lanes. To allow autonomy in many situations in life is foolhardy, to say the least. Our freedom and trust is enhanced by strict limits on personal autonomy for the greater good of community. We could list many such restrictions on personal autonomy: quarantines for highly infectious diseases such as Ebola, prohibition of using highly toxic chemicals and pesticides on private property, the limitation on raising farm animals in the residential area of a city. In these cases and dozens of others, we recognize that the greater community good supersedes individual autonomy. To retain limits on personal autonomy in the case of physician-assisted suicide is for the greater good of society. To remove the restriction on personal autonomy could very well lead to the crumbling boundaries that our Liberal colleague from Winnipeg Centre referenced a few weeks ago in this chamber when he said, quote, "We are in a sorry state. We have truly entered a new age, one of a throwaway culture where all boundaries are starting to crumble," end quote. So, Mr. Speaker, I fear for the kind of Canada I will leave for my children and grandchildren if we rush blindly ahead with an endorsement of physician-assisted suicide. The risk to society is too great. The dangers are far too real. There is no doubt that in spite of our best efforts to place so-called safeguards to protect the vulnerable among us, there will be situations where innocent Canadians will be killed without their express consent. There is no doubt in my mind that in spite of our best efforts to spin the difference between suicide and what we are now calling medical assistance in dying, there will be correlating increase in the suicidal rates in Canada. Aaron Karati, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Medical Ethics Program at the University of California at Irvine School of Medicine, states, quote, "The debate over doctor-assisted suicide is often framed as a personal issue of autonomy and privacy. Proponents argue that assisted suicide should be legalized because it affects only those individuals who, assuming they are of sound mind, are making a rational and deliberate choice to end their lives. But presenting the issue in this way ignores the wider social consequences. What if it turns out that individuals who make this choice, in fact, are influencing the actions of those who follow?" End quote. He goes on to report that in states where physician-assisted suicide has been legalized, there's been an increase in suicide of 6.3% overall. But among those over 65, an increase of 14.5%. He continues, quote, "These results should not surprise anyone familiar with the literature on the social contagion effects of suicidal behavior. You don't discourage suicide by assisting suicide. Aside from publicized cases, there is evidence that suicidal behavior tends to spread person to person through social networks, up to 3 degrees of separation away. So my decision to take my own life would affect not just my friends' risk of doing the same, but even my friends' friends' friends. No person is an island." Finally, it is widely acknowledged that the law is a teacher. Laws shape the ethos of a culture by affecting cultural attitudes towards certain behaviors and influencing moral norms. Laws permitting physician-assisted suicide send a message that under especially difficult circumstances, some lives are not worth living, and that suicide is a reasonable and appropriate way out. This is a message that will be heard not just by those with a terminal illness, but also by anyone tempted to think he or she cannot go on any longer. Debates about physician-assisted suicide raise broad questions about societal attitudes towards suicide. Recent research findings on suicide rates press the question, what sort of society do we want to become? Suicide is already a public health crisis. Do we want to legalize a practice that will worsen this crisis?" End quote. So, Mr. Speaker, I believe that life is always to be chosen over what some would call death with dignity. There is nothing dignified about deciding to end someone's life that is not worth living. If a patient has a need, let's address the need. Our goal should be to eliminate the problem, not the patient. Mr. Speaker, I think we need to be doing far more to address the needs of vulnerable Canadians, and to that end, Mr. Speaker, I have 5 proposed changes that need to be included in C-14. 4 of these have been accepted as amendments by others in the House. First of all, the preamble should contain a statement indicating that suicide prevention is an important public policy goal, recognizing the sanctity of life as a societal principle. Out of time? Okay, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try to get those in when I respond to a question. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
I listen closely to my friend's comments, and I understand he disagrees with the Supreme Court. He disagrees with their protection of individual liberty, disagrees with their protection of security of the person. My question for the member is this: if he disagrees with the Supreme Court's decision, is he calling on this government to exercise the notwithstanding clause?
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that certainly raises a good possibility, and I think to invoke the notwithstanding clause would in fact give Parliament the kind of time that we need to address and study this important issue. But, Mr. Speaker, to see the rush with which this government has moved forward on an issue of such intense, immense significance is really inappropriate. We saw in the Joint Committee a lack of ability to get many witnesses in. We saw that same thing in the Justice Committee, and today we've seen a number of examples where we've wasted hours on quickly moving other bills forward to the agenda when we as members were informed that today, beginning at 10 o'clock this morning, we would begin to discuss C-14. We have not had enough time to discuss this issue, Mr. Speaker, and it's of too great a significance for us to allow this to proceed in its current form. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. L'honorable député, the
Honourable member.
Innisfil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I realize that the honourable member did run out of time. I was actually starting to take note of some of the changes that he was proposing. He started in the preamble. So I'd like to ask the honourable member what other changes he is looking to propose in the legislation.
Member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you very much, and thanks to my colleague for this opportunity. Secondly, I believe it's important that we ensure that a palliative care consultation must be done to inform patients of the full range of available treatments and support services that are available, and actually ensure that they are available. We also need to insist that a prior review by a judge or a panel to ensure that no coercion exists and that all of the criteria are met. And then finally, to protect, penultimately, to protect the conscience rights of healthcare professionals at institutions. I think we heard earlier, Mr. Speaker, the fear that if institutions are not protected in terms of their conscience related to this, patients may actually fear going to those institutions. And finally, if physically able, the patient must self-administer the lethal substance rather than having a doctor administer that substance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question commentaire. Questions and comments. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Montcalm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague seems to be creating confusion when it comes to the clarity of this debate. I'd like to ask him to, in a succinct manner, tell us what difference he makes between a crime of compassion, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and suicide.
For Kitchener-Conestoga.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think I clearly indicated the differences on this in the first speech I made on second reading. Mr. Speaker, you and others in the House will know that over the last 8 to 10 years, I've devoted a lot of energy into the issue of mental health issues and suicide prevention. But here we're talking, Mr. Speaker, about so-called compassion. And I don't see anything compassionate about ending someone's life prematurely. The very word compassion means to suffer with. And you cannot suffer with someone whose life you have simply terminated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Toronto-Danforth.
Thank you. It's my understanding, in fact, that this issue has been before the House about 11 times since 1991, and I know that my colleague was present for the special joint committee, but they also had an external report. There was a provincial and territorial report. The special joint committee, in fact, heard from more than 60 witnesses, heard from read more than 100 reports, and my understanding is that even today there was an offer to extend the time for debate. which I believe my colleague and his friends did not approve of. So my question for him is how much more discussion, particularly in light of very big similarities between his two speeches, how much more debate do we really need on this point?
The honourable member for
Mr. Speaker, I
Kitchener-Conestoga.
just simply want to mention again that we lost hours and hours of debate time this morning when we could have been debating this. But more importantly than debate in this House, Mr. Speaker, is that we did not take the time, either in the Joint Committee or in the Justice Committee, to hear from groups across Canada who wanted to appear before those groups to share their concerns about this proposed law. And had we taken more time to listen to those Canadians, I'm sure we would have a different result moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Before we go to resuming debate, I'll let the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary